think this is my Presbyterian father-in-law's counting the congregation for a face.
Good afternoon and welcome to Grace Church. For those of you who are visiting with me, we're glad you're here with us. For our regular folk, thank you for coming back to celebrate. You may be aware, October 12th, 1846, was the date that the letters of incorporation were signed for Grace Church, which means we have just started the celebration of our 175th year of being here in Mansfield. And that's what this is part of. Each month we'll be doing activities to celebrate that for the next several months. And outside the office here, as you pass through, there are some exhibits about the history of Grace that I invite you to look at when you leave. There's also, interestingly, invoices for two of the original windows that we're going to hear about today that were put in 1911. The big window back there, for which they paid $1,500 in 1911, and the Angel of the Tomb, which was $450. But the original receipts are there and you can look at. And there's a book there that I invite all of you to sign. You'll see where it says, this is the book that was used at the 100th anniversary of Grace Church. The dinner. And then when we had an event on October 10th, we all signed it. We'll sign each of these events this year as a record of the ongoing celebration of this year. And there's a sheet that has events for this year as well that I hope you'll join us for. And I think that's about it. Afterwards, please join us back in the fellowship hall for some light refreshments. So, Danny, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. We've talked about this off and on for about 5 years, maybe 6. So I'm glad to finally be here. I should mention, is this working? Okay. Before I get started with the important stuff, I should mention that while I have a BA and a BFA from Yale and a master's from Penn State, my doctorate is apparently strictly honorary. Anyway, thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. Was probably the easiest doctorate anybody ever got. The other thing excuse me, my voice seems to be quitting. The other thing I should mention is geez, there it goes again. I won't say fortunately. I had anticipated this perhaps being the walking around a dozen or so of us in a close group when you would be subjected, unfortunately, through an unfortunate error of scheduling. I had a chunk of the tip of my ear removed of basal cell carcinoma taken off Friday morning. So I am here looking a little bit like I'm channeling Van Gogh, or maybe more appropriate to the subject of the day is Malchus. You know Malchus? He was the apocryphal servant of the high priest whose ear was cut off by the Apostle Peter in defending Christ against those who took him in custody that night. And Christ healed the ear instantly, unlike Dr. Villalobos. And we were all warned that he who lives by the sword shall die by the sword. Anyway, I will try. I was going to bring a bottle of water in with me. I could commit the ultimate sacrilege and sip from the holy fountain. Anyway, that being said, what we need to do is go back about 1,800 years, or punt, depending on what you Bengals and Browns fans want to have happen later today. Go back about 1,800 years when Constantine the Great issued the Edict of Milan in 313. I will apologize one more time and keep going and pretend I'm not squeaky. Anyway, the Edict of Milan theoretically made it safe for Christians to come up out of the catacombs and worship above ground. And so the big question, in addition to are we really safe, was what kind of a building do we erect? Certainly not one of those bloody temples, those pagan temples which surrounded them. And even the synagogues were a little hinky as far as they were concerned. So they looked at the totally secular buildings that were available, and they came up with the feeling of the basilica, which was, as its name would suggest, a long, narrow building. Even as my wife's favorite vintage. How I can have a favorite vintage of water, I'm not sure. Yes, thank you. I will put it in my pocket as opposed to... Anyway, yes, I think maybe I can get through this now. The problem was that this was a pagan-style building which had to be converted to Christian usage. It was essentially a longer, narrower building, thick walls, rounded arches, a colonnade supporting arches, and these big blank walls. Well, that didn't work as well as I thought it was going to, but thank you again. These big blank walls were covered with mosaics and with paintings, which served both as decoration and to educate the largely illiterate congregation. As the Romanesque period evolved, the Roman-ish, the kind of Roman, round arches, heavy walls, but more paintings than mosaics. The mosaics had migrated to the floors by the 1100s, say. Then the subsequent period, which was the Gothic period, that's when it begins to be home. We begin to feel a little bit more familiar. As the walls are opened up, buttresses and flying buttresses support the walls, which previously had to be strictly weight-bearing. The walls could be opened up with great sheets of glass. They could become curtain walls, and the walls became storytelling. They became glowing mirages of light and color, foretasting of the city of heaven, and these wonderful architectural Gothic buildings. We see the residue of them in the architectural decorations that frame the panels. The arches, the crockets, the pinnacles, all of these Gothic elements that surround the very tops and also along the bottoms are really a replica in glass of some of the Gothic architecture that was opened up and replaced by glass during the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. As Gothic architecture became taller and higher and lighter, more pointed, with the pointed arches, for example, the evolution of glass developed tremendously. And actually, most of the techniques that were used on these windows, and in fact the Badonishes in their studio in Lexington are probably using today. When you make glass, you blend the silicon from sand, potash, and metal oxides, metallic oxides, which give it these wonderful glowing colors. And you read a whole chemist palette. Gold would be melted into the metal to give these wonderful, wonderful reds. Cobalt would make blues. coppers would make green. Manganese would make purples. The white, which was a typical of this early Gothic palette, came from antimony and tin, cadmium and lead and arsenic made a whole palette of golds and yellows and oranges. So most of the colors that you see here had evolved from the alchemist's crucibles into the glass blower's crucible. The glass blower would take a galler of glass, this molten metal, on the end of his blowpipe, and he'd blow it into a bubble, let gravity pull it out into a long cylinder or an oval, and he even would use centrifugal force, try to say that one, would expand into this long tube called a muff piece. These could be cut, flattened, and eventually converted into these glorious see-through mosaics. While the glass was being created, an artist would make a drawing based probably upon miniatures, paintings in books, not magazines, which hadn't been invented yet, or from bas-relief sculpture. And these drawings would be blown up to life-size to make a life-size cartoon. Not Mickey Mouse cartoon, but cartonnage, coming from the Italian word for heavy paper. These cartoons would be life-sized figures the size that they would eventually end up in reality. These figures were laid out onto the cutting table. Glass of various colors was laid over them and then would be cut to fit these patterns. The glass that was to be hands, feet, faces, wings, the drapery, anything that needed detail could be painted with enamel, which was then fired, and the painted pieces and the fused colored pieces would then be held together. And you see the leading, which holds each piece of glass side by side with those surrounding it. Technically, they were called canes, but they were H-shaped channels that would fit around each pane of glass. They would be held together, fastened onto the horizontal iron rods, and then this whole structure cut and fitted into the carved wooden, as they are here, or stone, as they are in the great European cathedrals, which would be the final framework, which would hold these combination window, walls, paintings of storytelling fantasies in place. And appropriately enough, during this whole early Christian period, this period of recognition, when the early structural forms were being evolved, this was when St. Jerome was writing the Latin Vulgate, putting all of those stories from both Old and New Testaments together into what we consider to be the Orthodox Bible. Then there are all those other things, the Apocrypha, where all the neat stories came in or were kept out. But I don't think we see too many of them around us today. Anyway, with that as an introduction, we need to quite literally look around painting to painting, wall to wall, window to window. The first is the Nativity, appropriately enough. It is the Word made flesh. It is God condescending to be born in the body of Mary and live as a human being for the next 32 years, we're told. You all have watched the Charlie Brown Christmas multiple times. You can hear Linus's plummy little baby voice saying that there was at the same time shepherds keeping watch on the hills, and the glory of the Lord spread around them, and they were sore afraid. And we even see, excuse me, deity, that I hope doesn't annoy you as much as it's annoying me. I'll pretend I'm not aware of it, and then maybe we all can forget it. When you look at a painting, or in this case, at a piece of glass, you can start identifying the images in it. There's the star with its long comet-like tail. There's the stable. It's actually a ruin with a thatched roof. There's the manger. There's the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in the manger. There's the ox and the ass, which were incidentally symbols for strength and humility and all those virtues which Joseph himself, as the ultimate adoptive father, embodied perfectly. And then we have the shepherds, and they came with their sheep. They couldn't leave the little lambs up on the hills. And the one in the purple robe, or a purple, looks like a fleecy in the foreground, actually is carrying his bagpipes with him. Pipes weren't a Scotch invention. They were a Middle Eastern invention, which made it into Italy and then Ireland and Scotland and so forth. The baby is, if we're putting on our pediatrician's hat, our gynecological bonnet, we may think the baby looks a little too old for a newborn, and Mary certainly looks a little too sprightly and content for a newly developed, delivered woman. But they fit into this whole image of this miraculous, glorious evening, the way we'd like to think of it. The next one, and I think I warn you all, or I should tell you all, I have been fully vaccinated. I shouldn't be spewing nastiness all over you, and if your mask is protecting you, I think I probably can speak better without some other layer across my face. The next one is a very typical image of both early Christian and throughout the Renaissance, but it's totally misconstrued. It represents the presentation in the temple. There's the temple, there's Mary, there's the baby Jesus. Again, sitting up and looking around. This took place 8 days after Jesus was born. It's called a bris. The baby was presented at the temple to a priest called a mole, who circumcised him into the covenant of Father Jacob and Yahweh, announcing, making the Israelis, the Jews, with God's chosen people. Christ was a Jew from the day he was born to probably the day he died. A super Orthodox one towards the end, but a Jew nonetheless. So was Mary. What we see is what would have happened 40 days after Christ was born. An Orthodox woman would be welcomed back literally into the congregation of the synagogue of the faithful, purified from the ritual impurities of childbirth. So we have an 8-day bris and a 40-day presentation at the temple taking place in one event. When we can pull the prayer book off the rack in front of you and look up the Church of the Women, which is still a ritual of the church, celebrated on the 2nd of January, February. Anyway, in addition, as if that weren't enough to have in one window, we have Joseph standing behind Mary with a pair of doves in his hand, which were being sacrificed in thanks for these blessings. And then we have Simeon. Simeon was the rabbi, the priest, who had been promised that he would live to see the Messiah. And he saw the Messiah. And his reaction is, God bless, now I can die. Talk about the ultimate bucket list. I see the Messiah and I can die. And this is confirmed by the prophetess Anna, who's kneeling on her cane in front, who again recognized Jesus as the Messiah. So all of these images are superimposed in what is just masquerading as a nice light show. The next one is probably a little more familiar. It's Christ finally realized they didn't have him. They turned around, went back, and found a scene which we can believe this is a fairly realistic presentation of Christ very calmly expounding the law to all of these elderly, knowledgeable rabbis and doctors of the Talmud, of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books of Moses. And they have a tendency to be a little bit Hebraic caricatures. After all, these were done by a bunch of Germans in the community. What would you expect? This piece was done by a bunch of Germans, which I am, by the way, so don't take it as dissing the whole race, creed, or religion. But anyway, when Mary and Joseph, who are seen in the background, found Jesus in the temple, and he looked up and very innocent, when the kid gets lost at the mall, he wasn't lost, the parents were lost. He knew where he was. He said, why did you question where I was? You should have known I would be in my Father's house. The first time that we're told that he recognized that he had a father other than Joseph. From the Christ among the elders, we go to Christ among the babies. Suffer little children, come to me, and forbid not to eat in my presence. Right, verily I say unto you, except you believe as a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is essentially a kind of a supra-orthodox attitude. Here are the two disciples of the apostles. Don't recognize who they are, although it frequently is the custom of painters and therefore of glass people and other illustrators to use certain signs, symbols of indications of who the specific holy people were. In this case, either so subtle they don't pick it up, or they are generic old apostle and young apostle, setting up an elder generation. The Christ is telling essentially, back off, let the babies come. And this is really the exact opposite of the Christ among the elders, which is, speaking of Jewish orthodoxy, this is literally the words on the baptismal font, suffer the little children to come unto me. And so the whole thing is light, it's cheerful, it's gay. The way the sun is coming through it, it's like a taste of heaven. These little children are actually believing. They're seeing God, they're seeing heaven. And the elders are looking on with what's going on here. Christ talking to these women, these children, these babies. It's all light and cheerful and happy and gay in the original sense of the word, with lots of flowers. Flowers in bouquets, flowers in hands, flowers on robes. And once again, you see how closely the imagery of Gothic architecture in the framework around it ties into the whole idea, because the Gothic cathedral could be construed as being a foretaste of heaven. As this light came through the windows, it was like being carried into the seventh heaven. So we have this kind of wonderful, cheerful, happy, optimistic scene. Next is a very dogmatic, I suppose you could say, doctrinaire scene, transfiguration, when Christ took Peter, James, and John up on the top of Mount Tabor, to pray, and they were astounded because his face glowed, his robes glowed. He was surrounded by this wonderful glowing radius, this aura of light. He was literally transfigured. And appearing with him in this glow were two of the great Old Testament fathers, Moses on the left, Elijah on the right. Elijah, who was the only figure who went directly to heaven without having to die first. Perhaps there's significance in this scene. And of course, Moses, who spoke to Christ's Father and received the Ten Commandments Commandments. Significantly enough, the 3 commandments that are written on one side, instead of being the usual 5 and 5, the way you ordinarily see the numbers, or the way you read the whole commandments, on the left are the 3 biggies. I am the Lord thy God, and thou shalt have no other God before me, and you shall make no images. This must have really rattled for the glass people. You'll make no images of anything that walks on the earth, flies in the air, or swims in the sea. But what was really meant is you'll have no idols, no graven idols. And the third, of course, is you shall not desecrate the name of God. You shall not take God's name in vain. So he's reiterating again this Old Testament teaching in his person as the Son of God. And part of this vision is auditory, for the voice of God is heard, saying, "Behold my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." Believe him. Listen to him. And, of course, Peter, this is as close to the iconic image of Peter as we have at Grace. With the short beard and the short hair, he's usually depicted as wearing blue with a kind of an orangey yellow robe over it. So here it becomes a damascene robe over his blue with his very St. Peter the Sailor Man hair and beard. James, in the middle, being Jesus' cousin, there is a certain family resemblance. And of course, John is the youngest, the handsome, vaguely effeminate upon occasion, beloved apostle. So the whole thing is this kind of humanity with Christ, with the members of the Old Testament hierarchy, and the recognition of Christ as the Son of God. And Peter, once again being the enthusiast, said, "Oh, I'm so happy to be here and to see this. What we should do, we should build 3 tabernacles, or a tabernacle with 3 rooms, or 3 houses, or however it's phrased, in recognition of sanctification of Jesus with Moses and Elijah." And Christ warns them, "No, don't say anything about this. You have seen nothing. Don't say anything until the Son of Man is risen from the dead." And so again, he's speaking of his humanity as well as his divinity. The divinity and the humanity come face to face in the next window, which is the agony in the garden. After the Last Supper, after Christ had told his apostles exactly what was scheduled for that night, the next morning, the next day, he asked them to come with him to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he took, again, Peter, James, and John a little apart and asked them to watch with him. He knelt and prayed and was totally, literally, the dark night of the soul. His humanity and his divinity were at war. He knew physically what was going to be done to him. And if you haven't seen my wife warned me, never go, It's the most offensive sound you could ever make. The Passion of the Christ. Which comes pretty close to making you think maybe that's what it was really like. Anyway, his humanity and his divinity are warring. And he kneels, and an angel appears before him with a cup, and he prays that, "Let this cup be taken from me. Except if it can't, thy will be done, not mine." And the gnarling of his hands and the shadowing of his face really depict this anguish that he's going through. And the crosses that appear on his robe foreshadow where this is going. And then the moon. We know it would have been the full moon because it was the beginning of Passover. which was the first full moon after the fall, after the spring equinox. And yet it's a darkened moon, it's an eclipsed moon, it's a, artists have this love of painting this leering, darkened moon staring down at Christ. There are lots of scenes which the good folks at Grace could have asked for, but we skip from the agony of the garden to the morning after, literally. Everything is skipped. The seizing of Christ, his agony in the garden morphs directly into the anguish as he is interrogated by the high priest, as he is interrogated and beaten by the Sanhedrin in a totally illegal nighttime session. Then he goes to Herod, who plays hot potato with him, with Pilate, each of them trying to pass the buck, literally. And Christ is crucified. Christ is the descent from the cross, the entombment. All of those scenes are skipped, and we morph directly to the next morning. And we can look at the next morning either from the human point of view of the three Marys at the tomb, or in the really marvelous resurrection behind us on the wall. The Roman soldiers, of course, are very significant because while Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had the political and religious clout to request Christ's body from Pontius Pilate to be buried in Nicodemus's tomb, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish political and religious authorities, demanded of Pilate a whole cohort of Roman legionaries to be sure that those nasty followers of that Jesus fellow didn't steal his body and pretend that he'd really been resurrected from the dead, as the myth was going around. And we see how effective that was. Christ was resurrected. Christ sprung from the tomb. The great symbol of his death, the torture implement of the cross, becomes the symbol of his resurrection and the banner of his resurrection. And the power of the Roman Empire sits dejected or falls back completely aghast, agape before the power of the risen Christ. They can kill him, but they can't keep him dead. It's basically the message. And the two angels sitting by the tomb, one with the Easter lilies, symbol of the Virgin Mary and her purity, and the martyr's palm, symbol of the triumphant Savior. And again, all of the little images around it, the angels, the Alpha and the Omega, the tabernacles, the pinnacles, the re-evocation of Gothic architecture makes it really quite a marvelous, quite a glorious image, which always reminded me, I have always misspoke. I am the way and the light, saith the Lord. Actually, it was the life, but I like it as the light because the dawn of Easter morning, he is the light. He rises with the light. And that's what the artists in this window depict. On a much more somber, human note, it's like, funerals are when we get to feel sad for ourselves, not for the people who have gone ahead. And here we see the people who are still here, the three Marys at the tomb. The tomb is vacant. The stone has been rolled away. The sarcophagus is empty. There's nothing there but a gloriously shining young man whom they did or didn't recognize as an angel. They, the rest of the people personified, Mary Magdalene in the foreground with her great long, usually depicted as red hair. The other two Marys, probably Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and probably Mary Salome, the mother of James. These three went ahead to anoint the body according to the usual custom on the third day. And they found, as I've said, the tomb vacant. And the angel said, "Why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here." They had no inkling of what we have on the back wall. All they saw was the empty tomb and the angel who told them to go find where the men were hiding, because they expected there was going to be a total putsch against all of Jesus' followers, and warn the apostles that Christ had risen and to come to the tomb and see it themselves. And so Mary Magdalene becomes the apostle to the apostles. And that's as far into Maryism as I will choose to go today. But it's a fascinating study long before Dan Brown dragged us all through it with many ramifications. I'm going to have to just kind of describe the windows that you can't see from where you are. The one which is a real enigma to me. If you're sick and tired by now of me pontificating like I know all about everything, I'll confess that I'm really totally unsure as to what the next window depicts. My immediate reaction, of course, is a risen Christ. He's wearing his resurrection red robe. He's showing the stigmata. He's rising off the ground. So maybe it's just a resurrection. There are three apostles with him, one of whom is recognizable as Peter by the haircut that we see there, and there. And the other two could be James or John. Pick any two apostles, and whoever your favorites are. I assumed, I think incorrectly, that it was a Christ on the road to Emmaus. However, there were only two on the road to Emmaus, and one of them was probably Cleopas, and the other one was probably Cleopas' wife. And they didn't recognize Jesus until they had dinner with him, or they didn't have dinner with him. It was when he broke the bread and blessed it and gave it to them. They recognized him, and he disappeared. After he had told them to tell the apostles to meet him in Galilee. So this could be, in fact, Christ meeting the apostles in Galilee. That's my apologia for not being able to tell you exactly what's going on. The next one is pretty obvious. It is the Good Shepherd. It is literally Christ with all of the shepherds, all of the sheep. It's quite literally, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. It's as close to an absolute illustration of that as you can get. And it also evokes the Good Shepherd, who was more interested in saving that one who had gone astray than in the 99 who were safely in the sheepfold. And since I've always had a sneaking suspicion that I wasn't one of the 99, I've always felt extremely sympathetic for the one that Christ usually shows wrapped around his neck. This same sheep motif is picked up in the other one, which some of you will see, but not all. It's obviously baptism, appropriately enough, here in the baptistry. And also there's a dove, which follows into the old Roman name for a dove coat where you keep the ashes of your dead. So it's doubly significant, even when the font has been moved out. And in this, we see very clearly that it's John the Baptist, the voice crying in the wilderness, the man who lived on now locusts and wild honey. He's clad in his iconic camel's hair robe, and he's much neither barbered and bearded than he usually is, where he usually has that really wild, ravaged voice crying in the wilderness look. Typically iconic for the Baptist is his long staff, a couple of reeds tied together, and wrapped around it is the bannerole which says, "Behold the Lamb of God." So we have actually Ecce Agnus Deus. And of course, there's the Lamb of God, mild, meek, mild, bearing his shoulders, bending his body, which is covered with a robe, covered with crosses, a white robe with crosses in glory, significant perhaps at the beginning of his public ministry. And above is the dove, which I mentioned before, and once again the voice of God is heard, saying, "Behold, my Son, in whom I am well pleased." It's kind of fun, the lilies, which we see depicted around various places as the Madonna lily, the Easter lily, the purity of the lily. In the beauty of the lily, Christ was born across the sea, battled in the Republic and all that. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Here the water lilies stand in for, or augment the white lilies, the peace lilies, which is kind of a nice, neat playing on the idea of the river Jordan. And in John's hand, you'll see what John is holding. What John is holding is exactly the same thing that lay here for baptism. It's the scallop shell, which has been a symbol of birth and rebirth and resurrection through water and from water, ever since literally the beginning. And maybe the most famous one is that one which is rather eschatologically called the Venus on the half shell, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which you have this marvelously naked Venus on her half shell being blown up to her sacred island. So you see that the shell was not only symbolic for Christians, but for the pagans. Pagan, by the way, merely means living out in the country, pagani, folks who, after Constantine made Christianity a fair dinkum religion, still lived close enough to the land that they followed the old traditions, and they worshiped the old gods. So calling somebody pagan is merely a descriptive and shouldn't really be considered to be dissing them too much. This window, which I know none of you can see, and there have probably been more people in and out of grace who have never seen it, perhaps those who have, is a mystery. There are those who claim that it was done by Nativity Studios, and I kind of subscribe to that theory myself until I spent as much time looking at these windows in preparation for this afternoon as I had, and then I realized that that whole architectural structure all the way around is the same architectural structure that Mayer used in Munich. It's a slightly different technique. It's heavier leading, but it still is, I think, by the same studio. Here it's a pair of saints side by side, very iconic kind of presentation. The first that you can't see is St. Michael, the apocalyptic angel, the angel who trampled Satan and the fallen angels under his foot, which is in fact what he's doing here. An angel which is very pale gray-green, very lizard-like, very serpent-like. And on Michael's shield is Quis ut Deus. Quis ut Deus is the, it can be construed either as Latin for who is God, or who is like God, or who is God now, said Michael as he looks down and tramples the image of tramples Satan, who tried to raise himself up as God. Or it also can be construed as the Hebraic or Aramaic spelling or pronunciation of Michael's name as who is like God. The other image, and also very, very kind of pre-Raphaelite. This was a style late 19th, early 20th century, Burne-Jones and a bunch of those artists. The style of the faces, the style of the painting, the style of the clothing and so forth, very much in that period. We're told that this is Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is usually depicted in armor, as you know. This woman, I would prefer to think of as Mary Magdalene, but I promised I wouldn't get into any more Magdalenian lore. I'll simply say that this beautiful young girl standing in a garden full of exquisite white lilies in a robe covered with roses in front of a tree could be Joan of Arc as the maid of Dom Marie in the garden behind her parents' house while she is hearing the voices of the angels and of God. And as she stands there with her eyes closed and her hands up, it's almost like she's going to cover her ears to real sounds or praise God for the sounds that she can hear. I'm blowing smoke, but that's the beauty of a really well-done window, that you can read anything into it you want. And if you're very careful, you won't be hit by lightning. I wish you could come up to the altar with me. So I will merely say the next time you come up to the altar, look immediately to your right as you step out, because you'll see a very small and quite exquisite window. A window which, again, following the whole idea of saints and holy people, are garbed in or carry things which allow people to identify who they are. We've got an angel blowing a trumpet. Come on, we all know that that's Gabriel blowing his or her horn. This is the last trump. This is the end of the world. Appropriately enough, a good image to see as you've just risen from receiving communion. And of course, as appropriate, it was the donation of the altar tool, kind of tucked up here in their end of the world, where they have their ministry, to have the altar prepared for services. As I believe it was explained in the back issue of Church Life a couple of months ago. Then, of course, the one, it's that old cliche, and I will introduce the person who needs no introduction. If he doesn't need any introduction, why am I introducing him? Possibly because you know this as the Last Supper, not as a Seder. A Seder is the ceremonial meal which Jews partook of each spring to celebrate the freedom of the children of Israel from bondage to Pharaoh in Egypt. And they celebrate this with ritual questions and a ritual meal. And among the meal is very sweet wine, Mogen David, and flat, unleavened bread, matzah. If that sounds a little bit like the basis of the communion celebrated at the altar, so be it. Other things involved were bitter herbs, chopped sweetened fruits, lamb shank, all of these things Christ and his apostles ate in harmony together at the Last Supper. Because, as I said before, Jesus and the apostles were Jews from the day they were born, maybe till the day they died. But then, something changed, and that's what this whole image is about. It's we took bread and we break it. He blessed it and gave it to them, saying, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you and for many." And likewise, after supper, he took the cup, and when he had blessed it, he gave it to them, saying, "This is my blood of the New Testament, given to you and to many for the remission of sins. Drink this as oft as ye shall drink it in remembrance of me." So he took the ritual Seder meal, one of the cornerstones of Judaism, and flipped it on its ear and became the beginning cornerstone of Christianity. And so that's more or less the moment that we are showing here, because Christ has taken the cup and he's blessing it and he's ready to give it to you. But look and you'll see that the loaf, the bread, is unbroken. So when precisely this occurred, we're not sure. There's a couple of other interesting things about this image of the Last Supper. Most artists, as I said before, rather carefully try to let you know who the various holy people were by how they look, what they wear, what they hold. And here there are only 4 people that we can recognize. Obviously Jesus, obviously Peter, since I've already given you the clue as to the balding head and the short trimmed beard, and John, the youngest, most youthful, rather effeminate looking young man. Oh, and Judas. Judas, who you can recognize by his absence. This makes you wonder, when precisely did Judas leave? When precisely during the ceremony, the ritual meal as presented by the 4 apostles in their Gospels. When did Judas leave? We know that Christ had a dissertation, a discussion with him, that one of you will betray me. And Jesus would be betrayed by Judas. And Judas left to go about his business of betrayal. So when was this? The loaf is unbroken, the cup is being raised, the urn and the basin from the foot washing is still there. There's even that strange little thing over on the left-hand side in front of one of the apostles, a little glass of yellow liquid. And one is seriously tempted to think, since these were probably done by Germans, that this may have been a very thirsty glass man who was waiting to get off duty to go have a glass of beer. In any event, it's one of those little puzzles that's been tucked in there for us to wonder about. Also, we can wonder about Judas. Judas, we're told, was the betrayer. He was the one who lost faith in Christ. He was the one who was disappointed that Christ wasn't going to be the one who led them physically, militarily against Rome. He was so disappointed that he betrayed Christ to the high priest and to the Sanhedrin. And so Judas has been condemned as the betrayer, the worst, or almost as bad as Satan over there. But think of it through this way. Without Judas, there would have been Christ would not have been seized. Without Christ being seized, there would be no crucifixion. Without the crucifixion, there'd be no resurrection. Without the resurrection, there'd be no salvation. I'm not saying we owe Judas our salvation, but for those of us who are fairly human, we can look at the caricature of humanity and all its worst characteristics that are embodied in Judas and think, maybe we're not so bad after all. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. It was a glorious afternoon. The sun behaved itself. If my earpiece had behaved itself, and my voice, we'd have all gotten through this very, very well.
Thank you, Danny. And, more than anything else I've said, he told us what these windows were about, preaching the message. But he gave us an incredible experience of how these preach the story. But thank you, and I invite you to spend time looking at them more closely, enjoying them. You might ask Danny some questions. You come with anything particular. I'll ask any of us, and we'll tell you what we know about them. Not much, sometimes. And as I said, there are refreshments back in the fellowship hall. But thank you for coming, and we hope you'll join us for some more of our 175th anniversary events in coming months. Thanks, Nick.